Alright, hey everyone, Fireman here. I'm coming to you today. I want to bring a updated video on how to use my newer version of the ENB for Skyrim Re-Engaged. First off, let me just apologize for my voice. I've been fighting a cold. Actually, I lost my voice for a couple days and finally starting to get it back. But I am getting ready to release my next version, 2.8.1 of Skyrim Re-Engaged, which is adding some new stuff to ENB version. Really no changes for the reshade version. So I'm making an updated video on how to use this ENB version, how you can tweak it if you need to, as well as I'll even go over some of the reshade changes, how to do some reshade changes as well, for those that are not familiar with reshade and ENB. But also let me answer this question because I've been getting asked, well, Byron, why are you using a reshade and plus ENB? Well, first off, this was based off one of my Witcher 3 reshades, Wild Hunt Re-Engaged, and I ported over to SkyrimSE when it came out, and ENB wasn't out yet at that time. Although I'm happy with the color changes that my reshade was able to achieve, so I've been kind of sticking with that right now. Plus, it allows me to keep a reshade only version for those that don't want to use ENB, so when I make changes, I can easily copy the reshade files over to the reshade only version so that both versions are getting the same type of color changes, and then I can use the ENB to fine-tune some other things and give some better effects, at least that I feel are better effects, over the reshade only version. But the color changes will be pretty much the same between the two. So plus also ENB currently for SE is not up to the level that old Skyrim was at with ENBs, so that's why I'm kind of sticking with the reshade plus ENB for that version. So alright, so let's talk about some of these files here and everything. So it's still in the current 2.8.1 that's going to be coming out here. It's still the same file setup. You're going to have your default folder plus your presets that you want to use, whether that be, vanilla lighting, vivid weathers, or Clemson Tamriel. True storms, if you're only using true storms, you can use the vanilla lighting. But if you're, say, using Vivid Weathers and True Storm, or Clemson Tamriel and True Storm using the patch, you're going to want to use the version for the weather mod that you are using, not the True Storm version, because it will still see the Vivid changes and Clemson Tamriel changes depending on whichever one you're using. So the default version folder that you guys install have all the main files that you're going to need to get installed into your game folder, which you'll see in my other install video. That's still good to go, that you can still use that. It's just going to be some of these other changes. So you're always going to install all these files first. The reshade only version only has the reshade parts. It doesn't have the ENB, so it's the exact same file setup. It just doesn't have the ENB series, ENB local, and ENB series files. That's it. Everything else is exactly the same. So I'm just going to stick in this file for now as I go through and explain these things. So when you install your preset and you open up whether you're going to use Ultimate Edition, Quality, and Color Correction. Remember, Ultimate has the MXAO, Bloom, and Depth of Field active. Quality version does not have those three things active. It still has all the color changes and sharpening and that stuff. And then Color Correction has no MXAO, Bloom, Depth of Field, HDR, and sharpens disabled as well. So it's just kind of the effects that you need just to see the color changes. But you're going to pick your preset, and then it's going to have the files that are going to overwrite the default folder with the changes for that preset. So let's first talk about the reshade folder, and I'll go through how to look at the reshade files and how to make changes in those reshade files to your liking. I don't think that you would have to change much in here at all. They're pretty good, I think, as is. But let's talk about the SweetFX file. All right, SweetFX is where I have most of my color changes and everything like that. Basically, when you see a line like this, a 0 means off, 1 would mean on. So if you see a 0, it means I am not using it for my reshade. If you see a 1, it means I am. So for example, let's keep scrolling down here. HDR. I am using HDR. Again, it's disabled in the color correction, but it is active in the quality and ultimate presets. But you can adjust if you think HDR is too strong. Lowering this value will make the image a little bit more brighter, where increasing it will make it a little bit darker, but I don't think you're going to have to mess with that. And here is the hotkey for it as well, F11. If you want to change that, you can leave the VK underscore and then just change it to a key that you want, whether that be like a home key, end key, F11, 12, whatever. You can do that. The reshade only version does use Luma Sharpen in reshade. The ENB version, I actually have Luma Sharpen active in the ENB as of 2.8.1 that will be coming out. So I'll show you how to do that in the ENB as well. But the Luma Sharpen would be a 1 in the reshade, and you could adjust the strength of it right here. So if you want a less sharpening, you would lower this 1.60. If you wanted it more, you would increase it maybe 1.8, 2.0 if you want to go that high, but you could do that. Levels I would just leave alone. You don't really need to mess with that. I'm using Technicolor 2 and DPX, which is changing, which provides most of my color changes just between these two settings right here. So if you want to say adjust the red strength, for example, you would want to increase this value if you want it stronger, or if you don't like the red strength, you can lower it. Remember, as of 2.8, I really reduced the red strength compared to 2.7 and earlier versions. It was a little bit strong. Even though it was pretty close to these values, it still overpowered the blue and green for some reason. So I did lower it, but if you want to lower it down even more, you can. And then same with the DPX, really you could probably leave these alone, but you could mess with the red C, green C, and blue C. If you want to reduce the red strength, you're going to actually want to increase this value. If you want to make it stronger, you would lower this value. Lift gamma gain is going to be your kind of your brightness and stuff like that. It's going to adjust. You could, if you want to make things a little bit brighter, you could increase these values. If you want them darker, you could lower these values. The reason that I did leave them active like this, even in my ENB version, which now has day-night interior DNI separation, I left them here because, remember, I want to have the same reshade files between the reshade only and the reshade and ENB. So I basically adjusted my DNI settings even with these settings here, so that I'm making sure you guys that are using this reshade only are getting the same look as far as colors and brightness and stuff with the reshade plus ENB. So, but again, I'll talk about the DNI settings with ENB here in a little bit when I go over ENB files. Curves is your contrast adjustment. If you want to make things a little bit brighter, you would actually lower this value. If you want to make things darker, you could increase this value. But little increases make big changes, and that's the thing with reshade. When you make changes, you want to do a little bit at a time, nothing drastic, because it will affect things. Even if you're up here messing with a red, say I go ahead and increase this up to 60, you're going to see a little bit more strength in your blues and green colors. So you want to be, very small in your adjustments. Film grain I am no longer using. The earlier versions with dither I would go ahead and leave as well. But that's that for the SweetFX files and how you can adjust the reshade stuff if you're wanting to do that. The custom FX, let's see. Now, if JawZ is on, which I believe it is in the reshade only version, this would be a 1, and you can adjust the blur strength with this value right here. You can lower it to make it softer and increase it to make it a much stronger blur effect. That's really the only thing there. And then the other thing is my tuning palette, which is in all presets because I use my own custom LUT files to change my color gradient and everything like that. So you want to make sure that stays active. So, but that's the reshade files right there on what it does for changes. Now let's talk a little bit about the ENB files for those that are using the ENB version. I'm going to quickly go through these ones because I'm going to actually show you how to adjust it in game, which is actually better than sitting here in these files, but I'll still go over these files for those that are wondering how to do it. So the ENB series file, this is what's showing you what effects that you have active and everything like that. Again, for the ultimate preset, you'll see true for depth of field, which means it's on, bloom, and enable post-pass shader, which now in 2.8.1, I'm going to have the ability for you ENB users to sharpening is going to be done through the ENB, but also as well as add vignette, film grain, letterbox, and blur effects, but they are going to be disabled by default. If you want to use them, you're going to have to enable them yourself, and I will show you how to do that as well. Use effect needs to stay true because you are using ENB. If you change that to false, it will disable all ENB effects, and you will only be using my reshade changes. Use original post-processing. In earlier versions, this needed to be true, but now with my new DNI file settings, you're going to want to keep this off so that you are using the new DNI settings. If you change this to true, you're going to be using the game's default brightness contrast settings, but you'll still see my reshade changes. You just won't have the new DNI changes, and I'm going to show you guys that here in game here in a little bit. usual original bloom is going to be false because you are using my bloom. The other thing that is kind of a downside with the DNI settings is when this is false, you cannot use the original bloom in game because you are no longer using the game's post-processing stuff. You're using the ENB, so you do not see the in-game's bloom. Like if you're using Vivid, you're not going to see the bloom for Vivid itself. Same thing when you do adjustments with, like, say for example, Vivid, because it makes changes to interior darkness via the book in the in your inventory. When you make changes to that, you're not going to see them. You're going to have to use something like Darker Nights mod. Climates in Tamriel, you'll be okay because Climates of Tamriel uses its own separate plugin add-on, so that will still work. But where Vivid Weathers uses it through the book and as post-processing to change the darkness, you're not going to see it, so you're going to have to do another way. This you can just leave right here as normal, but if you want to adjust brightness and stuff in game, you can do that. But there's a better way to do it via the DNI, and I'll show you how to do that. Let me real quickly back out to this because normally you would see the ENB local file when you install, and this is where you can enable VSync through the ENB, which I would recommend if you're disabling the in-game VSync. For those that are having performance problems, it's always recommended to disable in-game VSync and use something like MSI Afterburner or your driver to enable the, not MSI Afterburner, I'm sorry, that's to cap your FPS, but through your driver to use VSync that way, or even through the ENB. I have the limiter on by default to 59, but if you want to disable it, you can just change that to false, and I also show you how to do that in game. All right, let's go back into these ENB series. All right, so let me go into the preset actually, so you can see what I'm changing. So these are the files that I'm changing for the preset. So the ENBEffectPostPass actually has the file changes for, if you want to turn on blur, you can change that to true. Sharpening, it is going to have sharpen by default, but you can actually change the sharpen amount right here. Currently it's at 1.25, but you can increase it if you want to or decrease it. Vignette, I don't have it on, but you can turn it on if you want to. Film grain, I also have off, but you could turn it on if you want to, and letterbox as well. But you can turn these all on in-game, and I will show you that here in a little bit. ENB effect, this is where all my DNI settings are, which again, DNI is nice because it allows you to adjust saturation, brightness, contrast, tone mapping, and adaptation based on the time of day, whether that be sunrise, sunset, daytime, nighttime, interior. You can actually adjust those individually instead of having one blanket brightness contrast setting that applies to every time of the day, which I have to do with the reshade version, which makes it hard for me to balance out, having, good looking days, but maybe you'll find darker nights or darker interiors. If I adjust for brighter interiors, you're going to get a very bright day, which makes it very hard to do. But with this, solves that issue, makes it a lot better to work with. ENB depth of field, these are the depth of field settings. I'm going to again show you how to do this in game, but you can mess with this, like if you want to change the focal point, like if you want it more, this is where the point that the focal point would be on screen. So X being, going across the screen left and right, and Y being up and down. So if you want to push your blur out further, you could actually increase far blur curve or lower it. But I wouldn't mess with too much of this other stuff here either. And your ENB bloom, these are the bloom settings that I'm currently using. You can mess with these. My bloom is very subtle at this point, because if I try to make like fires and stuff look really nice and stuff at night, like a little bit brighter, but it turns the day into super bright, and I don't like the super bright daytime, so I had to kind of find a good balance point. Plus it also messes with snow, and you're being like a snowstorm and everything will be super bright if you start to increase some of these values and make it mess up. So I think I got a good balance point here for the presets. Let's see, the bloom folder, these are the type of blooms that you have available to you, and then you need this for the ENBEffectPostPass to work. So that's the files in your game folder and how to mess around with those. Now what we'll do is we'll go into game, and I will bring up the ENB menu, and I will show you how to adjust the ENB menu. Alright, so We're in game now, and I'm going to show you how to adjust your ENB stuff if you want to in game, and I'll explain the ENB menu and how to use that. So obviously we got to hit Shift Enter to bring up the ENB menu. And so there's a couple things here on the left side. So here we have the limiter. Again, it's on by default, capping at 59, but if you want to change that, you can easily change that. Same with the engine here. We got the VSync. I have it disabled by default, but if you want to use it, you can just check it and enable. Just note that if you make any changes, if you do not hit save, it will not apply the next time you start the game. So if you want it to permanently save, you'll have to hit save to make sure that it saves with you. Now let me go over the statistics thing here, which is very important when it comes to messing with the DNI settings. So basically ENB is breaking down each time of day based on dawn, sunrise, day, sunset, dusk, and night. The numbers here correlate to the value of the time of day. So for example, we're at about 55% of my DNI settings are coming from the day and 45 at sunset. And it will eventually just start to increase here and then start to decrease as this one increases, and so forth and so forth. So if you want to know what time of day that you are currently in, if you find that a certain time of day is too dark, too bright, and you want to adjust it, you can expand the stats tab and look at the value here to see what you need to adjust. And I'll show you that here in a little bit. Use effects, again, you want that enabled, otherwise it disables the ENB and you're not using the ENB at all, so you want to leave that. Use the original post-processing, you want to keep that off because if you enable it, you are now using the game's default settings, so we don't want that. Let's see, bloom, same thing, you leave that one off because you're using my bloom. But for the original bloom, if you want to use that, you would have to use original post-processing for it to show. Dithering did not really working currently with the current ENB. Adaptation, you can use it if you want to. Basically simulate your eyes adjusting in bright and dark weathers or lighting. I don't care for it in video game, but you can use it if you want to. Bloom, again, it's very subtle, not overpowering. I basically used it just to light up the area just slightly. And not take away the coloring, like washing out the coloring in the nights in the skies. Lens, the vivid weathers has its own lens, so you don't have to worry about that. And then depth of field, the depth of field effect, like blurring the background, you can see it there, and if I disable it, no longer shows. Color correction, leave this alone because, like I said, you have your own brightness setting you can use, so you can just leave that at 1. If you make any changes here, it's going to apply to every time of day, and you don't really need to worry about it. So it's based off a brightness setting of 1, so just go ahead and leave that there. Depth of field and all that stuff you can leave alone. Alright, let's talk about the DNI settings a little bit if you wanted to adjust. So that's going to be under your ENB effects, and here's all the settings for it right here. You can see that you have brightness, dawn, sunrise, day, adaptation, tone mapping, contrast, everything like that. I would probably, for basic users, just don't worry about the adaptation. Leave those as they are. And you can do more of adjusting of the other settings such as brightness, contrast, and saturation. Obviously brightness explains itself. If you find things too dark, like right now, let's say you feel that this time of day is too dark and you want it brighter, you could adjust, like say you want to work on the sunset, you could increase it, decrease it, however you want. Same thing with contrast. If you want to mess around with contrast, you go down here, sunset, and lowering it's going to make it darker, increasing it will make it brighter, but that's, again, it's up to you on what value you want to use. Saturation, adjust the strengths of the colors during each time of day. The thing is when you increase it, it does darken up the colors a little bit, but it also darkens the image. Like if I want to make these colors a little bit darker, I can increase it, but as you can see, it darkens the image. So I probably would not recommend messing around with that too much. And I forgot what setting I was at, but it's alright, I got the file saved somewhere else and I just won't save. And then your tone mapping, it does work with colors as well. It kind of works on enhancing the colors a little bit, but as you increase it, it does make things darker as well, so you would have to mess around with brightness and contrast to kind of overcompensate for that. Over bright dampening is the ability for the the ENB to absorb some of the brightness. Like, so let's say it's noontime, you find that it's very bright, you don't want to mess with the brightness setting, contrast setting, you just want the thing to absorb a little bit more of the light, you could increase the value to absorb more of the light. These here I probably would not mess too much. It really can change the image quite a bit, even with just a 0.01 of a decimal change, so I would leave these and focus more on the changes in your brightness, contrast, and everything like that. So again, what's nice about this is instead of having one blanket contrast or brightness setting that you adjust and it applies to everything, so like let's say you find interiors too dark and you increase the brightness, now your days are going to be super bright. With this, it alleviates that. You can actually adjust it to your own liking. If you want daytimes more brighter, you can increase the brightness setting, mess with the contrast setting, and everything like that. So, alright, let me talk about this ENBEffectPostPass. So again, that's this line right here. You want this checked for you to be able to use the settings. Let's say you want to adjust your sharpening setting. You can go right here and adjust the strength of your sharpening. Again, it's at 125. You can increase it, lower it if you want it softer, but that's there as well. Vignette, you can mess with a vignette. Let's say I want to enable it. There's vignette effect, disable it, and you can mess with the settings here if you want to increase the amount of vignette effect, how wide do you want the curve, and the radius of the curve. You can mess with that here. Film grain, if you want to activate it, you can increase intensity and the saturation, the coloring of each individual film grain. A lot of people aren't a fan of film grain, that's why it's not active. If you like letterbox, you can enable letterbox if you're that type of person that likes it. I like it for screenshots, not a big fan of it when I'm playing, but that's there as well. And you can mess with the amount of the letterbox depending on what you want. You can change the value there. I think 80 is pretty good, especially when it comes to taking screenshots, and the HUD is actually in the black part if you want, so it's not messing with the HUD. So that's that, and let's talk about one more thing here, and that's the depth of field as well. Again, you can change your focal point, like where you want to be able to look for the depth of field to pop up. If you're looking straight up and there's nothing in front of you, it won't active, but if you bring it down and you got something close, it will bring in the blur, as you can see the distance there. You can change the far blur curve if you want to push. You're going to want to increase it to push the blur further back and lower it to bring it a lot closer to you. Near blur, I don't like to use. It basically blurs the screen like right the lower part and right around the focus point. I'm not a big fan of that. I just like the blur in the distance a little bit. So if you like the closer blur, like right around underneath your cursor, then you would want to use that and increase that value as well. So that is pretty much it on how to mess around with the ENB. I hope you guys like the new DNI shader that I was able to add in by Tapioks, and thanks to him for letting me use that and add it in here. It does help out when it comes to messing around with individual brightness, contrast, and everything like that. I think you'll find it a lot better. And if you have any questions about it, let me know. And if you find that you need something to work on, like maybe you're not sure, like, hey, dark interiors or well, let me say nights or something are too dark, don't hit me up and let me know what time of day that you are using. Is it a bigger part of sunset or sunrise, and you think it needs maybe a little bit better balancing out or whatever? Just let me know the time of day. Don't just say, hey, it looks too dark, because there's a lot of settings that I would have to look at to see about what's too dark or too bright. So you can look at that. But again, leave these alone to make sure that the effects are working properly. But if you don't like bloom, you can easily disable. If you don't like depth of field, you can easily disable. But again, I hope you guys enjoy the new version that's coming out. I've been having a lot of people testing it. The feedback's been good. And so I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions with it or any issues with the ENB part, let me know. All right, thanks. Have a good day.